So I'm going to now end with my assessment to do another overview and finalize my lecture on Judaism. That one, we had an ancient Israelite society that revolved around the temple, and eventually we had a territory that was integrated into the Hellenized world, the Greek world. And by that time, there were different strands of Judaism. Some revolved around the temple that was laid out in the Torah, with a priestly class that sacrificed animals to give blood at the temple to the God of Israel. And then you had these other groups, such as the Essenes and the Sadducees, the Pharisees in that case, that had built up this idea that there was that when Moses received the written law by God, he also had something orally, something that he learned from God that he passed on. So there was a written text, and then there was things that he knew that he then passed on, which the rabbis claimed that they basically had when they finally wrote it down in the 3rd century CE. We discussed the fact that it is generally the case that Judaism was not seen as a proselytizing or religion that created converts, but we do see pockets of it, and there's debates about the extent of it. I mean, even in the New Testament, there was groups of people called God-fearers who admired Jews, but they didn't want to get circumcised, for example. And then there was actually even the issue of converts mentioned, I think, in Acts chapter 8 of the Ethiopian proselyte. So that part is more or less something that could be explored. Ultimately, when you read the text, Judaism talks about a Jewish people that come from the tribes of Israel and that they have a covenant with God. And so then that's where it's kind of tricky. Is this an ethnicity or a religion or both? According to the Talmud, the rabbis claim that a person born of a Jewish mother is 100% Jewish. Somebody not born of a Jewish mother is 100% not. So my cousin, his dad was going to be a rabbi. His last name is Jewish. His first name is Jewish. But his mom was my aunt, who was a Catholic by birth, not Jewish. And henceforth, the rabbis consider him 100% not Jewish. Okay. And some of the Reform, I think the Reform synagogues have kind of broke with that, I believe. But it's hotly contested even in Israel, especially in Israel, actually. So you have that, and you had the temple being destroyed in 70 CE after the Romans punished a rebellion. Then we had in 132 the would-be Messiah Bar Kokhba, who led a larger rebellion, and Rome crashed down even harder and changed the name back to its Greek form eventually, which is where we ended up getting it to be Palestine. And then essentially Palestine, that area, is going to be under the rule of the Christians, then later the Muslims. And Jews will always have a presence there, and they will be a minority for centuries. And the traditional religious view of Jews was that only when the Messiah comes can Israel be reestablished as a state. And so when the movement in the 19th century came into being of calling for Jews to return to Israel, it was actually spearheaded by non-religious Jews who knew very little of Judaism, maybe even less than what you've been exposed to in this lecture, really. Herzl, as an example. But so the Bible was used as a historical document to justify a historical connection the Jews had with the land, not a religious one. Okay? The rabbis felt, a good chunk of them, if not the majority position of the rabbis at the time, was that this was defiance against God, and they were absolutely opposed to it. As Zionist settlement of European Jews started trying to go into the land, by this time it was owned by the Ottoman Empire, under the Ottoman Empire. There were some rabbis who claimed that maybe God was using these atheist Zionists as tools to help create the state of Israel, named Rabbi Cook. In any case, Israel does get formulated, which I'm not going to have time to go into, but the modern state of Israel is created in 1948. In fact, there's an Israeli historical book called 1949, The First Israelis. And that we're talking since the 2nd century, Jews were minority in the population, and then 500,000 Arabs Palestinians were expelled and fled, and that's a whole nother debate even within Israeli historians. But essentially, room was made for Jews to create a state, and it was the founding of the state of Israel was the Labor Party, a socialist party. The first state country to acknowledge Israel was actually the Soviet Union. And over time, as Israel has had its successes, the majority of Orthodox Jews have been won over to being favorable towards the state. And and what you have is in the charters of the Reform synagogues and the conservative in America, they officially say they are Zionists pro-Israel. Within Israel, you have really extreme fundamentalist groups, such as the guy who killed Yitzhak Rabin for even having a peace process. Keep in mind that an Israeli prime minister that created a peace process was killed not by a Palestinian terrorist, but a Jewish nationalist religious zealot who killed him. And they want to take more land in the West Bank, and they're very, very mean, many of them, to Palestinians. And they have they want to cleanse the land like the conquest of Joshua in the book of Canaan. And then you have on the opposite side a small group of Orthodox Jews that come out of the tradition prior to the state of Israel that are so opposed to the state of Israel that they claim that Israel is usurping the authority of God, that it's not a legitimate state. They actually side with the Palestinians, and you'll see rabbis with their beards and their locks and their Torahs, and they're marching with Muslims. And they actually say that Israel should be abolished. There should not be a state. They're not even saying that there should be a peace plan in the sense of, they're saying they want Jews to be able to exist there in peace. But what they're saying is that the rightful owners of the land are the Arabs and Muslims, and that they're calling for simply to let them study the Torah in the Holy Land, and that's it. And they have signs that say yes to Judaism, no to Zionism. So modern Judaism does kind of converge into the modern politics of the current Israel-Palestine conflict. But again, I want to argue, only until the 80s did the religious Jews or the religious Muslims really start taking place in the conflict. As I mentioned, many of the Zionists were secular atheists, actually. Ben Gurion, the first prime minister, was asked, does he believe in God? And he said, I'm a Jew. Jews have always believed in God. That was his way of kind of dodging the question. He was a socialist. He came out of a Marxist tradition. And the PLO was secular and had Arab Christians in it. Hamas comes later in the 80s and all this other stuff. Now, I didn't want to make this about the modern conflict, but I know that when we talk about Judaism, we talk about ancient Israel, and especially when I see the papers of my students, that the issue of Israel comes up. So, I think that if you keep in mind some of these things here that I just talked about, the conflict will make more sense to you. You'll realize that it's really a nationalist question. It's a question about who really has right to a land. Like, what gives people a right? Is it the religious text? The Zionists didn't argue that. Is it historical? Is it the fact that certain people suffer? Let's say the Holocaust. There's all these different factors that are drawn in there, and it's not just religion. In fact, religion is there, but it's not. And so I wanted to point that out. So Judaism comes out, it evolves because it shapes in these different ways. By the way, in the Islamic world, for the most part, Jews were often treated better in the Islamic world prior to the state of Israel. Now, that's a whole other topic. When I say better, I say meaning different regimes were better. That's a whole other topic, but I'm going to have to end it here. If you have any questions about this, please send me an email or call.